Good morning, YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. Sunday, the 1st of May. Just getting ready for the outsiders and the first dog on the moon. Apparently, it'll be the last first dog on the moon. He's saying goodbye to the ABC, or at least that's what they said earlier on this morning.
Time now for Outsiders. I'm Barry Cassidy, and you're not.
Indeed, yes. Joining you, joining all of us today, Adam Crichton, economics correspondent with The Australian, John Daly, CEO of the Grattan Institute, and Nassim Kadam, Business Day Deputy Editor for Fairfax Media. Welcome to you all. You're all set for a big budget on Tuesday. What's the level of excitement?
Oh,
I'm not
sure we could get too excited. This is a budget that's coming down a grand total of a week before we're expecting an election campaign to be called. I would be very surprised if we saw lots of unpleasant news in it, and I would also be very surprised if government tried to spend too much money because they've got a significant budget problem and they don't want to be seen to be making that worse.
Did you say money, John Daly?
Well. Got 90,000 pounds. I got 40,000 French races my bridge. I got lots and lots of lira, now the Deutschmark's getting dearer, and my dollar bills run by the Brooklyn Bridge. There is nothing but this
The problem is, Adam Crichton, I suspect Scott Morrison doesn't have £90,000 in his pyjamas. He's a bit light on for folding matter.
Yes, look, that's certainly right. I think one of the interesting things about Tuesday will be the revenue outlook and basically what assumptions the government's going to make there. I think it will be worse than it was 6 months ago, 5 months ago, whenever the update was in December. But nevertheless, it's worth pointing out that we'll still probably see revenue increasing as a share of GDP, fairly significantly. At the same time, while spending kind of flat lines roughly at a high level.
Let's start this chat with let's try and define the problem we're trying to solve here in the budget. Nassim, what is the position? What should this budget be looking at?
Yeah, there's two things. There's one is what this budget should be looking at, which most commentators will say is getting back to surplus. And there's another part of it, it should have been about tax reform and how that can assist the outcomes of getting back to surplus. Unfortunately, things that are economic friendly, growth friendly, often don't translate into being politically friendly. And so what you've seen is government cherry picking bits that are going to be politically beneficial to them and leaving out the bits that would not be politically beneficial. And so, you're not really going to see genuine tax reform, and it's very unclear how they're going to get back to surplus when they're, flagging things like personal tax cuts and company tax cuts. But where's the money coming from?
Well, John Daly, this is a budget which is somewhat hampered by its context, which is intensely political, and yet it's a budget which should have some heavy lifting to do.
And partly because nothing like enough heavy lifting has been done over the last 6 or 7 years. The reality is that the Commonwealth has been running a budget deficit of about $40 billion for the last 7 years. This will, I think, make it 8. And although this budget will no doubt, like the last 8, forecast a steady rise back to something that almost looks like surplus, the history of the last 8 years doesn't give us encouragement that things are just going to drift back to surplus. Governments are going to have to do a lot more of the heavy lifting in terms of both tax changes and spending reductions, and so far they haven't found a way to do that.
How much longer, Adam, can we keep sort of deferring this problem, do you think?
Well, it's a very good question, actually. It's worth pointing out, just on John's point, that since the financial crisis, Australia's public debt has actually tripled. It's the fastest increase as a share of GDP in the Western world, as far as I know. It's about 35% now once you include states as well. But the reason it's gone up so much is largely because of the federal government. So, look, that's still relatively a low level compared to other countries that are that level of public debt. But nevertheless, the rate of increase is very rapid. And we've already seen a couple of the major rating agencies say that they're concerned about the trajectory of Australia's public finances. So, I would say another year or two, and if there is no change in the direction, I think we'll see a ratings downgrade maybe to Australia in 1 or 2 years' time. That is if nothing changes and we just keep drifting along. But sadly, as as John has said, there has really been very, very little structural reform, and it's the fault of both sides of politics.
Well, structural reform, Nassim, is a really hard thing, and it's a thing which has really no political upside other than to try and sell to the Australian public that, look, here we are as a government being responsible economic managers, but that doesn't seem to be quite sufficient. We're caught in this what's in it for me sort of conversation around things like budgets and economics.
That's right. I mean, I remember in 2014, the OECD put out a report that said, here's a framework for how to get Australia back on track and make sure that you have policies that are growth friendly and that account for the mining downturn. And everything in that was pretty much stuff that politically they couldn't implement. So it said, you need to raise the GST and broaden the base. You need to look at tax concessions that disproportionately benefit the rich. You need to look at introducing inheritance taxes or death taxes. There's a whole raft of measures in there, and the Henry Review also had similar sort of measures that Labor couldn't at the time implement because the politics of it just didn't allow them to. It's really interesting that this time round, Labor's actually the one that's coming out and putting out some policies that might not be politically beneficial, like
courageously,
exactly, like negative gearing, and then the government's kind of responding to them. But it's in an election year, it's a really difficult thing, and it was actually the government's advisor, one of the policy advisors for the Board of Tax, Michael Andrew, who said they were wrong to tie it in with the election. They should have had a plan over 2 or 3 years and gone out and sold that to the public rather than trying to do all this in the budget.
And yet it was encouraging initially, was it not, John? I mean, with the transition of leadership in the government, that nothing was off the table, was what we were being told, that we should be prepared for a not rule in, not rule out conversation around revenue, around issues around the economy and budget. We kind of moved a bit away from that.
Well, yes. I mean, if you look at what we have talked about over the last 6 months, and which now appears to be essentially off the table, we've talked about GST, we've talked about a transfer of income tax powers to the states. The Treasurer talked about the excesses of negative gearing. We've talked about superannuation tax reform. That looks as though it might still be on the table, although I suspect it'll be much smaller scale than what many people, including us, have advocated. We've talked about corporate tax cuts. That's also may remain on the table, although I suspect it will be pushed out so that very little actually happens within the forward estimates. If you look at the tax reform table, at best has got a couple of P's left on it. There's no full banquet left.
And what we have, Adam, in its place is, you mentioned negative gearing. Well, I say, well, you're going to kill the housing market. We no longer have even a serious conversation. It's offer and scare. We've gone back to very basic politics.
Yeah, that's true. And just as we were saying earlier, I think the Labor Party deserves credit for actually having a couple of coherent policies, which are actually tangible. They're not just sound bites. So I think they've been leading the policy debate this year. There's no question about that. It's disappointing to see how little idea the government really seems to have about what it wants to achieve. I mean, John's just rattled off all those things we've talked about. I mean, it's kind of laughable, really. And yet at the end of that conversation, there's really nothing that the government's kind of achieved or announced yet. I mean, admittedly, we might see something on Tuesday, but from the sounds of things, there's going to be a slight tweak to one of the income tax thresholds. I mean, that is just a joke.
Which
frankly.
is all well and good, and we understand the politics of that, if the situation wasn't increasingly pressing, if we didn't actually have a problem we needed to grapple with.
Well, yeah, look, I think the political system is failing Australia, at least at federal level. Certainly, I think it's somewhat dysfunctional. I know the constitutional architecture obviously hasn't changed, but I think the inputs to it have, and the system in Canberra is really struggling to pass any sensible legislation. I mean, about 85% of spending, I think, is locked in through legislation. So unless the Senate actually agrees with the government, then nothing can really be done to fix the spending problem.
Outsiders here on Sunday Extra, and we're talking economics and budgets ahead of Tuesday's big moment for all of us. Adam Crichton, John Daly and Nassim Kadem with us. John, the point that Adam makes there, whether this system we have now can deliver sort of the policy outcomes we need, whether it can deliver the policy conversation we need. I mean, we're going to see on Tuesday night proof on that proposition one way or the other.
Well, I think the real proof comes once you see what does and doesn't make it through Parliament. It's worth remembering of the government's previously announced measures. There's about $4 billion on the books for the 2018-19 year that have still not been legislated and don't look as though they're going to get legislated, certainly by the current Parliament. And unless there's a pretty radical shift, I suspect won't get legislated by the next Parliament. And the biggest of those is the change to the family payments, parenting payments. There's also the pharmaceutical benefits scheme co-payments. I mean, interestingly, of those, the family payments actually not that different from what the ALP suggested when they were in government. So it is an issue when the system has reforms that either party, when in power, talks about, but then are very difficult to legislate because when they're not in power, they oppose them.
They see the political point of doing just that. Let's turn to what perhaps should happen on Tuesday night. Naseem, do you have a small shopping list of what ought to be?
In an ideal world?
Yeah.
In an ideal world,
in a world
theoretically.
free of politics and all that stuff.
One of the greatest things, KPMG, which funnily enough put out a great report, I think last year, that kind of said you have to look at everything and, included negative gearing and superannuation concessions, things that you wouldn't typically expect groups like that to advocate. But one of the things that they said makes the biggest difference to increasing productivity is actually getting women back into the workforce. Any suggestions that are put about getting women back into the workforce are quite controversial. Like, there's been a lot of discussion about having tax deductible childcare, but then that's sort of criticised for benefiting more wealthy women. There's been discussions about how to look at this problem where married women are disadvantaged in going back to work because if they want to access family payments, they're assessed on the husband's income as well. And so every dollar they earn, if they go back to work, they lose a family payment or a childcare benefit or something like that. So KPMG controversially said, don't assess them on joint income. That might get women more women back into work. They also advocated taking childcare companies providing childcare out of the fringe benefits tax system. So basically, they don't have to pay tax, and more companies then give childcare so that women will return to work. I mean, I genuinely believe that we do need to look at getting women back into work. It's such a big proportion of our workforce that's not in work. And I do believe that that would make a significant difference to productivity. But again, the options that you have for doing that are always going to produce winners and losers. And again, it's going to take some politically courageous politicians to come out and look at doing this stuff. So again, ideal world, but realistically, probably unlikely.
Adam, in your ideal world scenario, what would you go for?
Well, certainly there'd be a lot more reform than there currently is. Look, on the revenue side, there are so many good options for tax changes. We really should be kind of implementing basically all the Henry Review, basically, or all of the sensible tax reform strategy, with a plan over the next 3 years to implement it all. I mean, of course, that's going to be politically difficult, but that's what's got to be done. On the spending side, we've got 52 different welfare payments, seriously, still. And, we have a review sitting on there, the McClure review, and there's been very little action to simplify what is an incredibly complicated system. And then the more specific point I would make, I mean, I really think that, this might seem a bit crazy, but I think we should have something like an inquiry or a royal commission into health spending at the federal level. Because there's just so much waste of drugs and on procedures, which actually don't make any difference. And, we're talking billions of dollars a year here in spending, in public spending, which is ultimately benefiting drug companies and doctors, basically, at the end of the day, and hospitals, private hospitals. That we really need to look at this. If we don't look at these things structurally and really drill down to these massive spending programs, we're never going to save money or get the budget under control.
John Daly, what's on your wish list Tuesday night?
Well, I think Adam's got a point there, which is that if you're serious about trying to reduce spending, many of the things that are left are the hard yards of small reforms that cumulatively add up. So, for example, the government's got reforms
That's the upload limit. Back with a new movie directly.